On the day of the marriage alliance, I was reborn. I saw my sister Susan make the first move, snatching away the husband from my past life. Sis, I guess it's my turn to live the good life now. I had a feeling Susan had been reborn too. But she didn't know that all the wealth in my past life was earned by me. I chuckled and turned to embrace the wealthy heir. What's the point of being reborn if you don't bring your brain with you? Mom. I don't agree to this marriage. My consciousness was drifting in darkness when a voice suddenly jolted me awake. It felt like my soul had suddenly returned to my body, and I realized I was at the marriage banquet from my past life. I had been reborn. Mom, I refuse to marry Frank. Susan's voice was as sharp as ever, just like the knife she'd used to hurt me in the past life. Mom opened her eyes wide at her words and whispered. Have you lost your mind? Not marrying a rich man, who else would you marry? Her horrified tone almost made me laugh out loud. In my past life, my mom favored Susan and did everything possible to arrange her marriage with Frank, the rich guy. And me? I ended up with the down-and-out new rich, Tim. Susan eagerly announced, I want to marry Tim. Yes, the same flashy guy. Mom. Trust me, he's gonna hit it big one day. Susan was secretly annoyed. She'd pressed down on Jane for years in our past life, only to see her live well after marriage. While she ended up in the streets. No matter how it played out, she was determined to snatch Tim today, her means to wealth. Seeing Susan desperately trying to take my husband, I quickly assessed the situation. First, Susan was also reborn. Secondly, she was just as foolish. Mom was so mad she nearly fainted. Susan didn't know what went wrong in her brains, spouting nonsense endlessly. Starting my first morning watching a mother-daughter fight like that, I shook with laughter. Susan, you were supposed to marry Frank. Turning him down will insult Tim. I interrupted them, acting as if I meant well. Susan's voice was mocking. Jane, don't get too pleased. I will marry him, this time, luck won't be on your side. Susan, you're so loved at home. How could you marry a new rich? Let me take that instead. I tried to play on their emotions to finalize the marriage. No way I would marry the philanderer Tim again. Sure enough, Susan took the bait. Jane, how dare you hijack my husband, you're gonna regret it. Susan glared at me like a demon, as if ready to hit me if I dared say more. I put on a face of humiliation, but inside, I was secretly delighted. Since Susan was happy to misinterpret things, I wouldn't burst her bubble. By the end of the banquet, Susan must have pulled some strings with Mom. Before the night ended, 2 marriages were announced at home. Me with Frank, and Susan with Tim. Deep in the night, the lights were still on in the villa's living room. I pushed the door open. Mom was sitting on the velvet sofa. She turned, seeing me, her once kind smile vanished, and she turned away again. I urged her to get some rest, but she said, I need to arrange your sister's bridal gifts. Unlike you, she won't be living in luxury. I need to prepare more. I stared at the house deeds and jewelry Mom was assembling for Susan, and I couldn't help but ask. What about mine? Her hand paused for a moment, then she spoke impatiently. Your sister sacrificed her happiness to marry you into a wealthy family. Don't ask for more. Remember her good intentions, and support her when you marry into Frank's family. In my past life, they said I didn't fit into a wealthy family. Now, I had to be slighted for Susan. Mom, you're just so biased. I smiled coldly, choosing not to tell her that our family's company was in deep financial trouble. The next day, chaos reigned at home. Susan nagged our mom in frustration. Mom, with the company in trouble, couldn't you care about your daughter? If you truly love me, hand over Dad's company, so Tim can start a business. And Jane's too. She can't handle business anyways. Mom suddenly realized, you're right, darling daughter, still so smart, such great ideas. I watched silently as this mother-daughter duo congratulated each other. Since Dad's passing, I had been running the family company, yet somehow they stupidly thought I was useless. Susan shot me a disdainful look. Sis, don't blame Mom for favoring me. I'm gonna marry a billionaire, while you can only pick up the scraps I don't want. With a twist of her hips, she flounced off to cozy up with Tim. Watching her back, I shook my head, thinking, Susan's reborn but still so foolish. Tim, that playboy, was probably flirting with the new intern right then. I wasn't upset, though. There were plenty of surprises waiting for Susan with this marriage choice. Naive Susan believed I achieved my wealth thanks to Tim in our past life. But I could handle Tim. I wasn't sure she could. Now, all I needed to do was stand by and watch Susan's downward spiral unfold. So why bother? Let the show begin. 2 months later, Susan and I had our engagement party at the most luxurious hotel in town. Susan insisted on a joint event, all for sisterly love, she claimed. But I knew it was just because Tim was broke, and Susan was trying hard to keep his interest. The engagement party was being organized in full swing with top-notch luxury everywhere. Frank showered me with affection, wanting to give me nothing but the best in the world. He told me, only out of consideration for my family, he agreed to the joint engagement. Once engaged, he'd arrange a grander wedding just for me. On the day, the hotel was filled with laughter, clinking glasses, and the sound of champagne bottles popping. The bridesmaids and groomsmen peeked into the makeup room outside, exclaiming, "The bride looks gorgeous. Such fair skin, glowing." I blushed with embarrassment. No one had ever praised me so openly like Susan had. Frank's sister, Kathy, noticed my discomfort and smiled. She suggested the others help out elsewhere and promised a big red envelope for everyone after the engagement party, sending the bridesmaids and groomsmen away cheering. Kathy picked up a piece of chocolate mousse from a tray and held it to my mouth. I thanked her and took a small bite. If it weren't for the makeup I spent ages on, I might have devoured several cakes. Lightly patting my glamorous wedding gown, Kathy marveled, "Sis-in-law, your custom-made wedding dress is a limited edition this year, there are only a few worldwide." I almost choked at her description. Kathy quickly poured me a glass of champagne to ease the moment. Looking down, I saw a few crumbs on the pristine gown and felt heartbroken. "Kathy, this dress is so precious. I accidentally got it dirty. Do you think your brother will be mad? Will he think I don't care about our engagement?" I felt uneasy. Kathy giggled, "Oh, sis-in-law, no way. My brother's so thick-headed, he wants to give you the best of everything. He'd never blame you for a dress, he treasures you too much." Suddenly, I remembered, in a previous life, Susan wore a regular dress at her engagement, no luxurious wedding gown. My heart raced. Kathy winked and added, "Don't hold it against me for saying this, but my brother really likes you. He was so scared you wouldn't accept this marriage he didn't dare meet you and could only show it through all this. But knowing my brother, he'd never tell you, so I had to." A warm feeling spread in my chest. My lips parted slightly, eager to see Frank. In my past life, when I needed funds for my startup, Frank secretly helped many times. I always thought he did it for Susan. Turns out, that affection was always meant for me. Susan wore an expensive but tacky dress, mingling with the guests. In the past, these high society ladies treated her politely. But now, knowing about her engagement to Tim, especially after she repeatedly boasted about marrying her destined one, they laughed at her behind her back. Poor Susan had no clue. Even so, Susan was good-looking with a nice figure. Ever since she arrived at the party, Tim hadn't taken his eyes off her, full of lust and desire. I shivered. Susan's taste was quite bold if she put up with his gaze after the engagement. Or maybe, to Susan, it affirmed her charm. Throughout the party, Susan strutted around like a proud peacock, while Tim's new wife attracted envy for her beauty and style. Then, all eyes shifted to me as I entered the room. Everyone suddenly noticed my standout wedding gown and were envious. "This wedding dress I saw abroad is super expensive, and you can't just buy it even if you wanted to. Jane looks much better in that dress than Susan," another commented. In the crowd, Susan's nails dug into her palms. "Why does Jane get to wear this haute couture while I wore an ordinary gown last time?" Susan feigned warmth and linked arms with me, saying sarcastically, "The dress is nice, but not really fitting for you. For an engagement party, just any dress would do." Before she could finish, Frank strode over. In a sharp suit, charming as ever, he said in a low voice, "If my Jane isn't right for this dress, then no one is." Susan retracted her hand awkwardly, left standing on the side. Frank wrapped an arm around my waist, turning his back on Susan gracefully. Nearby, a few women whispered among themselves. "Susan's really low, speaking like that about her sister. You don't understand, her family invested everything in the older daughter. But look, the younger one grew up more beautiful and poised. Of course, Susan's jealous." Susan's face turned ashen. Usually, she would have snapped back, but with Tim's future business in mind, she downed her champagne and headed to the restroom. Watching her lonely retreat, I couldn't help but smile. Don't worry, Susan. The real fun's yet to come. Noticing my gaze, Frank leaned close and murmured, "What are you looking at? Are you upset about what I said to your sister?" His presence, warm and close, made my ears burn red, leaving me flustered. In the past, our social status separated Frank and me. He was poised and often advised me on career matters. Now, Kathy's words revealed a shy and timid side to him. I'd never have guessed Frank would come so close and speak like that. I stammered, not upset, I couldn't care less about Susan. Around Frank, I felt relaxed, like I never had to hide who I was. My real thoughts slipped out. Quickly covering my mouth, I realized I'd let my guard down. With others, I always kept a gentle and considerate front. Unsure of how Frank would react to my family issues and disdain for Susan, I took a step back to gauge his expression. Inadvertently, my fingers brushed his hand, sensing the warmth beneath his watch. A rush of electricity shot through me, making my head spin and knees weak. Frank steadied me, concern written all over his face. "Are you okay? Did you have too much to drink? I can have Kathy take you to a private room upstairs for a rest." I shook my head, softly asking, "Frank, my relationship with Susan isn't great. Do you think poorly of me for it?" Frank quickly reassured, "I know, it's not your fault. I was just worried you might get taken advantage of by your Susan without knowing." Hearing Frank's words stirred something in me, a little flutter of excitement. The engagement party was winding down when a commotion started at the venue entrance. I looked over and saw it was Tim's mistress, Anna. She's been with Tim the longest, and a lot of people heard about them. But Susan? She pretended not to know for the chance at some elusive future money. Anna, with a face full of tears, rushed over to Tim, crying her heart out. "Tim, I didn't want to cause trouble on such a happy day, but I'm pregnant with your child. I can't hide it anymore." Anna's miserable voice drew everyone's gaze. Susan was stunned. She never imagined her supposedly good husband would be cheating and mess things up at her big moment. Overwhelmed by fury and dizziness, she collapsed into her mother Kate's arms. Kate was at a loss, hurriedly ordering someone to hold Anna down. Tim stopped the security and others, then turned to Kate and said, "Mom, Anna's having my child. I'll take her home first, then I'll come back to see you and Susan." Kate was nearly driven to high blood pressure by Tim's shamelessness. In no time, the scandal spread among the guests. Jane smirked a little, thinking that karma had finally caught up with Susan. Now that she was in the spotlight, what would she do after she woke up? Kate, worried about her daughter, quietly instructed someone to offer Anna some money to get rid of the baby and let Tim be. When Tim came back, he awkwardly put on a smile, constantly toasting the guests, hoping to sweep the mess under the rug. Susan, coming out of her fainting, didn't confront Tim. Instead, she acted the part of a dutiful wife, smiling and entertaining guests as if nothing had happened. She even went home with Tim after the event. The guests were puzzled. How could Susan endure all this well? Is it too much for her brain to handle, making her snap? Susan, usually spoiled and pampered, called the shots. And Tim, suddenly rich, what had him hook her? A few days later, Susan was seen borrowing money, acting like Frank's wife, claiming it was for Tim's business. Many lent her some in respect for her family. If anyone's loan was too small, they'd get a nasty remark about not appreciating her family and Tim enough. A good-hearted socialite advised, "Don't put all your money on Tim. If your family goes broke, you'll regret it." Susan waved her off with a sneer, "You short-sighted folks, don't come running to me when we strike gold." The socialite rolled her eyes and left. Susan cobbled together a few million for Tim, while she stayed home doing housework, looking every bit the model wife. While busy, she'd murmur to herself, "When Tim makes it big, those laughing at me now will be at my feet." One morning, while I was still half asleep lounging in bed, Susan barged right into my bedroom uninvited. Kathy followed behind with a displeased face. I waved Kathy off, and she left. Sitting up cautiously and covering myself with the blanket, I snapped at Susan, "What are you barging in here at this early hour for?" Susan gave me a patronizing look, "You're a wife, and you're still lazing in bed instead of making breakfast for your husband?" I almost laughed out of annoyance. Even if your Tim is down on his luck, at least he used to be rich. Can't he afford a maid? Susan turned red, "You're being lazy here. You don't act like a wife at all. Frank'll leave you sooner or later." Smirking, I replied, if anyone gets dumped, it'll be you. Take a look at Tim's playboy ways. I leisurely got up and walked over to the vanity, catching Susan's eye on all my limited edition branded cosmetics. She was taken aback, muttering, Frank bought all these for you? She couldn't help but enviously touch them. But when she was about to open a bottle, I blocked her hand. Don't touch. They're not yours. I shot her a cold glance. Don't you have your own? Tell Tim to buy you some. Fuming, Susan flicked her hand and sat with a smug look, I've got plenty at home. Just didn't expect you to get this too. I picked up the skincare product, playing the part. Frank had bought them all himself. It was my first time using them, purely to knock Susan's smug face down a peg. Susan's eyes burned with jealousy, but recalling her purpose here, she put on a pitiful facade. Jane, if it weren't for me, you wouldn't have married into wealth. Now that Frank's money's at your disposal, maybe it's time to repay me. I glanced at her side eye, I don't have money. Just an unlimited black card. Susan's rage flared, biting her palm. Back when she married Frank, there was no black card, not even cash. All spending was on her family. She told herself to endure, hoping for wealth with Tim. Jane's current gloating was just temporary. Seeing Susan's grim face, I pretended seriousness, so you're borrowing money then? You've got guts. I added, I spend my husband's money shamelessly. So, now what? I get to be shameless, but you want to keep your and your husband's dignity? Susan snapped at me, Jane, how can you talk about my husband like that? He'll hit it big one day, and you, beware your spending. As Susan was ranting, Frank came in through the door. What's going on so early in the morning? The noise woke Jane up, and Frank wasn't happy about it. He frowned and said, Susan, you've already seen your sister's new marriage. Please, go home. Susan gave an awkward laugh. I just came to check on my sister's new life, she said. But Frank wasn't having it. He sighed and wrapped an arm around me. Honey, do you want to go out today? Susan watched with envy as he doted on me. She couldn't believe all her effort to marry well, and it was Jane who got the cushy life. Trying to hide her jealousy, Susan forced a smile. I'm relieved to see my sister so happy. You both take care, and I'll get going. She hurried off, but not before glancing back at us and our beautifully designed home. Anger and jealousy boiled inside her. She couldn't understand why Frank treated Jane so differently. If he had shown her this affection, she wouldn't have married Tim, the playboy, or felt belittled by Jane. No, it was Frank who let her down first. A few days later, back at the family home, I saw our mom handing some cards to Susan. Susan, she said seriously, I trust you. Invest this money with Tim and don't forget your mom when you succeed. Susan took the money without hesitation. Mom, I know what to do. Once I'm successful, you'll have a good life. Even as she spoke, her eyes were glued to the money. Kate patted her hand, I always knew you were the smart one. Not like Jane, who's always against me. If she'd only helped you out financially, you'd be settled by now. Yeah, she just wants to cut us off entirely. Don't worry, Mom. Once we make it big, we won't need her. Listening from a distance, I couldn't help but smirk at their conversation. They hadn't changed a bit over the years, one was selfish and materialistic, the other blindly biased. Rather than seeking a familial bond that wouldn't exist, I'd let them be. I knew Susan would waste Mom's money soon enough. When I returned home, Frank noticed my mood was off, so he changed the subject. I heard you want to start a business? He asked. Yep, I've always wanted to start a clothing brand, I said, putting away the sadness and diving into my business plans. Frank listened, nodding occasionally. In no time, my clothing company was officially up and running, and within a year, it gained a solid reputation. One day while checking out a store, I saw a woman causing a scene. She was decked out in designer clothes, and it turned out to be Susan. She was yelling at a young store clerk, demanding the girl kneel to help her with shoes. The young clerk was red-faced and holding back tears, too intimidated to speak. Susan, seeing her vulnerability, grew nastier and threw a wad of bills at her. With that attitude, you'll never be a good salesperson. Kneel and put these on me, and I might spare you some cash for your trouble. I intervened, smiling coldly. Susan, shouldn't you be at home playing the supportive wife? Susan eyed me suspiciously. Jane, what business of yours is it what I do? I helped the clerk up and told her to take a break, before turning back to Susan. This is my store, so it's definitely my business. You, on the other hand, should avoid causing a scene. Tim wouldn't want his wife making a fool of herself. Susan's eyes flared. Jane, why should I care what you think? Do you own this store because of some shady guy? I chuckled. Actually, I did it all by myself. You should be more worried about what you'll do if Tim's business tanks. Those luxury items won't mean much then. Susan was infuriated. What do you mean? Do you think Tim's company will fail? It's doing great, and soon it'll be listed. I'll outrank you in no time. I shrugged. Good luck with that. But from what I hear, Tim's company might not be around much longer. Susan seemed rattled but straightened her clothes with a huff. I don't have time for this. Wait and see what happens. She gave me a glare and strutted out. Turning to the young employee, I reassured her, if she ever comes back to hassle you, don't hesitate to stand up for yourself. The young clerk nodded, relieved. Susan's petty antics didn't take long to escalate. She soon returned with a group of wannabe socialites to stir up trouble. The young clerk, brave and holding a metal rod she found, scared them off with a fierce glare. When I heard about the incident later, I laughed so hard I almost fell off the couch. My predictions came true not long after. Tim's company was shut down, thanks to my handiwork. What Susan didn't know was that I had been scheming since their engagement. Anna, my planted insider, was gathering evidence. Early on, Tim had been selling fake medicine, passing off ineffectual pills for miracle drugs and ruining lives. When his business was small, evidence was easy to gather. But with Susan's money, his greed spiraled out of control. When the authorities finally caught up to him, he was gambling in a mansion with scantily clad women beside him. Susan was stunned that her efforts were wasted on a gambler. Even worse, as Tim was taken away, he grinned and shouted, "Honey, I'm sorry. Once I'm out, we'll start fresh with more investment." Susan fainted from the shock. After everything settled down, Anna came to me, shaking my hand excitedly. "Jane, thank you. Back when Tim was blackmailing me with those photos and forcing me to be his mistress, it was thanks to you that I finally escaped his clutches." I gently patted her hand. "I just gave you an opportunity. It was your evidence that brought Tim to justice. Since Susan funded him, she'll be spending the rest of her life in jail as an accomplice." Hearing this, I exhaled a long sigh of relief. The next day, I went to the trial of Tim and his wife. Susan was a mess, hair everywhere, tears flowing, begging for a lawyer. I watched in silence, feeling utterly calm. Then Susan spotted me outside the court, and I gave her a smug smile. That drove her crazy, and she lunged towards me. Court officers almost couldn't hold her back as she bared her teeth at me, even pulling at her surgery scars. Seeing her wanting to curse me but unable to, I stepped up and whispered, "Susan, I'm just like you. I expected your every move. Thank you for helping me get a new lease on life." Susan's eyes widened as she grasped my meaning. She tried desperately to break free from the guards, reaching out to grab my hair. Frank pulled me close and held me in his arms, shooting Susan a cold look. Susan finally broke down sobbing, collapsing to the floor, being dragged away. The news of Susan's sentencing spread quickly. Kate showed up at my store, throwing a public tantrum, claiming I refused to help my sister. Bystanders whispered, "What kind of person makes money and doesn't help her family? We should boycott businesses like this." A young store employee, seeing things go south, hesitated to confront the elder but quickly called me over. I rushed to the scene, cut through the crowd, and yelled, "Quiet. My sister and her husband made dirty money and hurt people. They got caught. Why should I rescue them? They deserve this karma." Kate grew more upset, wailing, "Jane, I raised you all these years, and now you watch Susan suffer? Can't you spend a little for a good lawyer to ease her sentence?" I chuckled, "Mom, you're really biased. Susan's done horrible things, and you blame me for not clearing her name. Relax, I'm not saving her. I'm even looking for evidence to add years to her sentence." Hearing the truth, the crowd began to understand and nod. This mother is something else, making her daughter clean up the mess of another bad seed, then spreading rumors, someone remarked. Kate, feeling humiliated, couldn't find words. She glared at me, yelling in frustration, "You ungrateful brat. You must want Susan to die. Fine, we're no longer family. Don't ever come to me." I ignored Kate's ranting and said calmly, I couldn't agree more. Then, I turned and instructed the manager to call the police. Not only did my store's reputation remain intact after all this, but business also boomed, and soon my company went public. In prison, Susan suffered and eventually died from illness. I arranged for her ashes to be sent to the Yi family. Since the Yi family had fallen on hard times and Mother stayed at home unaware of Susan's death, I also sent along some audio tapes of Susan badmouthing Kate for not saving up money. Even though I'd cut ties with my mother, I believed she'd be pleased with this gift, staying with her favorite daughter till the end. This was my final act of filial duty. At the company's launch party, watching the guests, I felt pure joy. With all my past grievances resolved, I could finally leave behind the bullied version of myself and focus on the present. Frank came over, gently wrapping his arms around me, jokingly saying, "Honey, it's all finally over. We can go on that date now." We shared a smile and a tender kiss.